Hi everyone, in today's video we're going to be talking about Plato's Euthyphro, and this lesson is going to be divided into two parts. So this is part one. Now the Euthyphro is usually taken as an example of something that brings up problems for a view called divine command theory. And divine command theory is really interesting in its own right. It's the view that basically all moral rules come from God's commands, or in other words, because God commands something, that makes it moral. But I think one of the problems here is that there's actually deeper problems in the dialogue, and in this video I want to focus on some of those. First, let me say something about philosophical problems in general. So first I wanted to say that philosophical problems, we really need to make sure that we understand what the problem is before we try to give solutions to it. The other thing I'll mention here about philosophical problems is that sometimes we know we found a really good philosophical problem when you try to give an answer to it, and it turns out that that answer leads you to further problems. Actually, the Euthyphro is going to be exactly one of those problems, as we're going to see. Now, I like to remind my students that one of the mascots for the course is this iceberg. And just like this iceberg image, we start oftentimes in philosophy with something that looks super obvious, like the little piece of the iceberg sitting above the water. But the moment you look below the water, you see all this complexity, all these things going on. And I often think philosophical problems are like that. They start with something extremely simple, and then before you know it, you've got all these additional questions and problems that you didn't realize were lurking there under the surface. Let's take a look at the problem in this work, the Euthyphro. Now, the beginning and setup of the dialogue, the Euthyphro, is pretty simple. Socrates is on his way to trial, and we see the details of that trial in the work The Apology. He meets Euthyphro, and we learn that Euthyphro himself is also on his way to trial. And as we're going to see, Euthyphro is going to be the prosecution in that trial. Now what comes next I think is really interesting. We're going to be presented with, I think, a controversial case. And I think that the question, how do we respond to controversial cases, that's what's really at the heart of the Euthyphro. Okay? So let's first take a look at this controversial case and see what you think. Now at this point in the text, Euthyphro says, "It is ridiculous, Socrates, for you to think that it makes any difference whether the victim is a stranger or a relative. One should only watch whether the killer acted justly or not. If he acted justly, let him go. But if not, one should prosecute, if, that is to say, the killer shares your hearth and table. The pollution is the same if you knowingly keep company with such a man and do not cleanse yourself and him by bringing him to justice." Now here's the case itself. We get this description. "The victim was a dependent of mine, and when we were farming in Naxos, he was a servant of ours. He killed one of our household slaves in drunken anger. So my father bound him hand and foot and threw him in a ditch, then sent a man here to inquire from the priest what should be done. During that time he gave no thought or care to the bound man, as being a killer, and it was no matter if he died, which he did. Hunger and cold and his bonds caused his death before the messenger came back from the seer. Both my father and my other relatives are angry that I'm prosecuting my father for murder on behalf of a murderer when he hadn't even killed him, they say, and even if he had, the dead man does not deserve a thought since he was a killer. For, they say, it is impious for a son to prosecute his father for murder. But their ideas of the divine attitude to piety and impiety are wrong, Socrates." Now, the next thing that's going to happen in the dialogue is that Socrates is going to ask Euthyphro for a definition of piety. And we're going to get into that in one moment. But I want to point out something here. Remember, right, why do we want a definition of piety? Well, it turns out that if we have a definition of piety, we'll recall that Socrates is on his way to his own trial. He has been accused of being impious. So if he has the definition, then he can use that at his own trial. Also, notice here that Euthyphro himself, part of the question is, when the father did what he did, was that a correct action? And also, Euthyphro's prosecuting his own father for murder. Is that a pious action? I imagine we're going to see here that these are pretty controversial cases. And so if we had the definition of piety, that definition could help clear up the controversy. And that would be pretty cool if we had it. All right, so what comes next in the dialogue? Well, next Socrates is going to ask Euthyphro for a definition of piety. And as you're going to see, Euthyphro is going to give 3 different definitions. Let's look at the first one. Okay, the first definition. Euthyphro says, "What I'm doing now is pious." Now, let's think about this definition for a second. Usually, when I'm talking to students about definitions in Plato's work, we're going to want a definition that covers all the things and only the things. So, for instance, say like we wanted a definition of chair, we would want a definition of chair that covers all chairs, right? So it does not exclude any of them. But we also want to make sure that that definition covers only the chairs. Now think about this definition. What I'm doing now is pious. First of all, notice that it doesn't cover all cases of piety. And this is a big problem. In fact, Socrates points this out in the text. Socrates says, "Bear in mind then that I did not bid you to tell me 1 or 2 of the many pious actions, but that form itself that makes all pious actions pious. For you agreed that all impious actions are impious, and all pious actions are pious through one form, or don't you remember?" So the definition is a problem because it's too narrow, right? It's an example of piety, not the whole thing. But notice that the definition, as stated, is also circular. Remember, the question was, right, am I doing a pious thing right now? Well, how would we answer that? We answer that by saying, well, what's the definition of piety? And if you answer that question by saying, well, what I'm doing right now is pious, notice you haven't really answered the question. You're just running around in a circle, and that's a problem. All right, let's look at definition number 2. Now, Euthyphro's second definition is what the gods love is pious. And as we're going to see, this actually leads to some complications, so we need to look at the text. At line 7a, Euthyphro says, "Well then, what is dear to the gods is pious, and what is not is impious." Socrates responds, "Splendid, Euthyphro. You have now answered in the way I wanted. Whether your answer is true, I do not know yet, but you will obviously show me that what you say is true." "Certainly. Come then, let us examine what we mean. An action or a man dear to the gods is pious, but an action or a man hated by the gods is impious. They are not the same, but quite opposite, the pious and the impious. Is that not so?" "It is indeed." "And that seems to be a good statement?" "I think so, Socrates." "We have also stated that the gods are in a state of discord, that they are at odds with each other, and that they are at enmity with each other. Has that too been said?" "It has." "What are the subjects of difference that cause hatred and anger? Let us look at it this way. If you and I were to differ about numbers as to which is the greater, would this difference make us enemies and angry with each other, or would we proceed to count and soon resolve our difference about this?" "We would certainly do so." "Again, if we differed about the larger and the smaller, we would turn to measurement and soon cease to differ." "That is so." "And about the heavier and the lighter, we would resort to weighing and be reconciled." "Of course." "What subject of difference would make us angry and hostile to each other if we were unable to come to a decision? Perhaps you do not have an answer ready, but examine as I tell you whether these subjects are the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly, the good and the bad. Are these not the subjects of difference about which, when we're unable to come to a satisfactory decision, you and I and other men become hostile to each other whenever we do?" "That is the difference, Socrates, about these subjects." "What about the gods, Euthyphro? If indeed they have differences, will it not be about these same subjects?" "It certainly must be so." "Then according to your argument, my good Euthyphro, different gods consider different things to be just, beautiful, ugly, good and bad, for they would not be at odds with one another unless they differed about these subjects, would they?" "You are right. And they like what each of them considers beautiful, good and just, and hate the opposites of these?" "Certainly." "But you say that the same things are considered just by some gods and unjust by others, and as they dispute about these things, they are at odds and at war with each other. Is that not so?" "It is." then the same things are loved by the gods and hated by the gods, and would be both God-loved and God-hated. Euthyphro answers, it seems likely. Now, we'll discuss the third definition in the next video. Before we do that, though, I wanted to raise a couple issues that we see in this text. The first issue is that the text lays out the type of problem we're dealing with. So in this case, we're dealing with a problem not of measuring things, but rather how we value them. And to give my own example here, let's imagine that we go to dinner, and after dinner, we're trying to decide how much of a tip to leave the waitstaff. Well, there's two questions here. One question is, well, if we decide that it's a 15% tip, how to calculate 15%. And that measurement problem is really simple, right? We just get out a calculator, or we take the bill, take 10% and add half, something like that. Very easy. But there's a second problem here, which is the value problem, and that would be how much of a tip should we leave, or what would be a good tip to give in this case. And problems like that are a lot harder to sort out, and I imagine the question, what counts as a good tip, would be something that we might disagree about. The second issue has to do with the depth of the problem. And here we come back to the iceberg, my mascot from earlier. So you would be tempted to think at first that the Euthyphro is all about piety, right? So we want to find out what piety is. But in this passage we learned that we're not simply talking about piety, we're actually talking about deeper concepts. It's not just an issue about piety, it's also an issue about justice, beauty, ugliness, fairness, any kind of value concept. And really, even if we're thinking of the gods judging something to be good, they become more like referees. Okay, so you can almost think of them like umpires in a baseball game. And their job is to call things as fair or foul, right? Ball, strike. Okay, that wraps up our discussion of the first part of Plato's Euthyphro. In the next video, we're going to look at that third definition, and we're going to talk about the deeper problem that it creates. All right, I'll see you there. Thank you for watching.